I've been driving trucks for 25 years, and I've seen some strange things on the road. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what happened to me last month on that lonely stretch of highway in eastern Nevada. It was just past midnight, and I was hauling a load of electronics from Salt Lake City to Reno. The road stretched out before me, a ribbon of black cutting through the vast emptiness of the high desert. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the occasional sagebrush and not much else. I'd been driving for hours and the monotony was starting to get to me. I reached for my thermos, taking a long swig of lukewarm coffee. That's when I first saw it, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. At first I thought it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again, clearer this time. There was something out there moving alongside my truck. I blinked hard, trying to focus. What I saw next made my blood run cold. It was a person, a figure, running alongside my truck. Now I know what you're thinking. So what? Someone was jogging along the highway. But here's the thing. I was doing 70 miles per hour. I nearly swerved off the road in shock. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. It had to be an illusion, right? Some trick of the light, or maybe I was more tired than I thought. But as I watched, the figure kept pace with my truck effortlessly, its legs a blur of motion. I could make out more details now. It looked like a man, tall and lean. He wore dark clothing that seemed to ripple in the wind. But his face, I couldn't see his face. It was obscured by shadows, as if the darkness itself was clinging to him. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I tried to speed up, pushing the accelerator to the floor. The engine roared, and the speedometer crept up to 80, 85, 90. But the figure kept pace, matching my speed exactly. It wasn't even looking at the road. Its head was turned towards me. That featureless face pointed directly at my window. I felt a bead of cold sweat trickle down my spine. This couldn't be real. It defied everything I knew about the world, about what was possible. Suddenly, the figure raised an arm, pointing at me. I felt a wave of terror wash over me. Without thinking, I slammed on the brakes. The truck's tires screeched against the asphalt. I was thrown forward against my seatbelt, the air knocked out of my lungs. For a moment, all I could hear was the ringing in my ears and the pounding of my own heart. When I finally caught my breath and looked up, the figure was gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, my hands shaking on the wheel. The highway stretched out empty before me, no sign of the impossible runner. Had I imagined the whole thing? Eventually, I managed to pull myself together enough to start driving again. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow on the road seemed to hide some unspeakable threat. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I finally pulled into a truck stop. I hadn't planned on stopping, but after what I'd seen, there was no way I could keep driving. I stumbled into the diner, ordering the strongest coffee they had. The waitress must have seen something in my face because she asked if I was all right. "Rough night," I mumbled, not meeting her eyes. How could I possibly explain what I'd seen? As I sat there, nursing my coffee and trying to make sense of it all, I overheard a conversation from the booth behind me. "I'm telling you, Jim, I saw something out there last night," a gruff voice was saying. "Some kind of runner, keeping pace with my rig at 75 miles per hour. I nearly choked on my coffee. Slowly, I turned around. 2 other truckers were sitting there, both looking as haggard as I felt. The one who had spoken was an older guy, his face weathered by years on the road. His companion looked skeptical. "Come on, Bob," the other trucker said. "You probably just dozed off for a second. We've all been there." But Bob was shaking his head vehemently. "I know what I saw. It wasn't human, whatever it was. The way it moved, it wasn't natural." I couldn't help myself. I stood up and approached their table. "Excuse me," I said, my voice hoarse. "But I saw it too." They both looked up at me, surprised. Bob's eyes widened with recognition, not of me, but of the experience we shared. "You saw the runner?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, sinking into the booth beside them. For the next hour, Bob and I compared notes, describing our encounters in hushed tones. The details matched up eerily well, the impossible speed, the dark clothing, the featureless face. Jim listened to us both, his skepticism slowly giving way to unease. By the time we finished talking, he looked as shaken as we felt. What do you think it was?" Jim finally asked. Bob and I exchanged glances. Neither of us had an answer. I don't know, I admitted, but I know what I saw, and I know I never want to see it again. We fell into silence after that, each lost in our own thoughts. The diner around us buzzed with the usual morning activity, truckers coming and going, the clatter of plates and murmur of conversations. But it all felt distant, unreal compared to what we had experienced. As I prepared to leave, Bob caught my arm. "Be careful out there," he said, his eyes serious. "Whatever that thing is, it's still out there." I nodded, a chill running down my spine at his words. As I walked back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking figure. Every movement in the corner of my eye made me flinch. For a moment, I considered quitting right then and there, calling my dispatcher, telling him I was done. But this job was all I had. And besides, what would I tell him? That I was quitting because I saw a man running at impossible speeds. So I climbed back into my rig, my hands shaking slightly as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, a comforting sound in the quiet morning. As I pulled out of the truck stop, I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. But I couldn't help glancing nervously at my side mirrors, half expecting to see a dark figure materializing out of the desert haze. The sun climbed higher in the sky as I drove, burning away the last of the night's shadows. Gradually, I felt my nerves begin to settle. In the harsh light of day, what I'd seen seemed almost laughable. A runner keeping pace with a speeding truck? It had to have been a hallucination brought on by fatigue and too much caffeine. But then I remembered Bob's face, the haunted look in his eyes as he described his own encounter. It hadn't been just me. Whatever I'd seen, it was real. As I continued down the highway, my mind raced with possibilities. Was it some kind of government experiment, an alien, a ghost? Each explanation seemed more far-fetched than the last. One thing was certain. I would never look at an empty highway the same way again. Every time I drove at night, I knew I'd be scanning the darkness, dreading the moment I might see that impossible runner again. The encounter changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I've always prided myself on being a rational person, someone who doesn't believe in ghost stories or conspiracy theories, but now I know that the world is stranger and more terrifying than I ever imagined. I still drive the same routes, still haul the same loads, but there's a tension in me now that never goes away, a constant alertness for things that shouldn't exist. Sometimes, on long night drives, I think I see movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of motion just beyond my headlights. In those moments, my heart races and my palms grow slick with sweat on the wheel. But so far, it's always been nothing. Just shadows and my own overactive imagination. Still, I can't help but wonder. Is it out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to appear again? And if it does, what will happen? I don't have answers to these questions. All I know is that the next time I see something impossible on a dark stretch of highway, I won't dismiss it. I'll believe my eyes. Because now I know the truth. There are things out there in the night, things that defy explanation. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, they run alongside your truck at 70 miles an hour, watching you with a face made of shadows. So if you're ever driving late at night and you see something strange in your mirror, don't slow down, don't look too closely, just drive, and pray it doesn't catch up to you. I've been driving 18-wheelers for over 3 decades, and I thought I'd seen it all. But what happened to me last winter, on that desolate stretch of I-80 in Wyoming? Well, it shook me to my core. It's the kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about reality. It was a bitterly cold night in late January, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you wonder if you'll ever feel warm again. I was hauling a load of frozen goods from Chicago to Sacramento, fighting to keep my eyes open as the endless ribbon of asphalt stretched out before me. The dashboard clock read 11:52 p.m. when I first saw the lights in the distance. At first, I thought it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. This part of Wyoming was notorious for its emptiness, miles and miles of nothing but sagebrush and the occasional antelope. But as I got closer, the lights took shape. A truck stop materialized out of the darkness like a mirage in the desert. Neon signs advertising hot coffee and clean showers beckoned like a beacon of hope in the vast emptiness. I blinked hard, sure that I was hallucinating. I'd driven this route dozens of times, and I knew for a fact that there wasn't supposed to be a truck stop here. But there it was, clear as day, or rather clear as night. My fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty, and my eyelids felt like they were made of lead. Against my better judgment, I decided to pull in. As I maneuvered my rig into the parking lot, I noticed something odd. The place was packed with trucks, but they all looked old. Vintage models from the 70s and 80s, the kind you'd see in a museum these days, not on the open road. I parked and climbed down from my cab, the frigid air biting at my face. The moment my boots hit the pavement, a wave of disorientation washed over me. It felt like I'd stepped back in time. The air smelled different, a mix of diesel, cigarette smoke, and something else I couldn't quite place. The sounds were off, too. Instead of the low hum of modern engines, I heard the rumble of older motors and the tinny sound of country music playing on AM radio. I made my way to the diner, my footsteps crunching on gravel that shouldn't have been there. As I reached for the door handle, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window and nearly jumped out of my skin. My face looked younger, much younger. The gray in my beard was gone, replaced by the dark brown of my youth. The lines around my eyes had softened. I looked like I did 20 years ago. My heart was pounding as I stepped inside. The diner was bustling with activity, filled with truckers hunched over plates of steaming food. But like the trucks outside, everything inside seemed to belong to a different era. The waitresses wore uniforms that went out of style decades ago. An ancient jukebox in the corner played Merle Haggard. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, something I hadn't seen in a truck stop diner in years. I stumbled to the counter, my mind reeling. A waitress with a beehive hairdo and a name tag that read Dolly approached me with a coffee pot. "What'll it be, sugar?" she asked, her voice raspy from years of smoking. I opened my mouth to reply, but no words came out. How could I explain that I didn't belong here? That this place shouldn't exist? "Cat got your tongue?" Dolly chuckled. "Don't worry, honey, we get all types here at the Midnight Mirage." The Midnight Mirage. The name sent a chill down my spine. I finally found my voice. Where exactly are we?" Dolly gave me a strange look. "Why, you're at the crossroads, darling, where all roads meet and time takes a breather." Her words made no sense, yet they filled me with a profound sense of unease. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It read 11:59 p.m. I think I need to go," I stammered, standing up so quickly I almost knocked over the stool. Dolly's expression turned serious. "Careful now, sugar. Once you leave, there's no guarantee you'll find us again. And trust me, there are worse places to get lost out there in the dark." I barely heard her words as I rushed out of the diner. The parking lot was even more crowded now, filled with trucks from every decade. Drivers milled about, some looking as confused as I felt, others going about their business as if this was all perfectly normal. I sprinted to my truck, fumbling with the keys. As I climbed into the cab, I glanced at my watch. 11:59 p.m. How was that possible? The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the parking lot, my tires squealing on the asphalt. In my rearview mirror, I watched as the Midnight Mirage grew smaller and smaller. And then, between one blink and the next, it was gone. The highway stretched out empty before me, no sign of the truck stop that had been there moments ago. My hands were shaking on the wheel as I pulled over to the shoulder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked at my watch again. 12:01 a.m. For a long time, I just sat there trying to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a dream, some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue? But I could still smell the coffee and cigarette smoke on my clothes. And when I looked in the mirror, I saw a faint lipstick mark on my cheek where Dolly had pecked me goodbye, a detail I hadn't even noticed in the moment. It had been real. Somehow, impossibly, it had been real. I don't know how long I sat there on the side of the road, shaken to my core. Eventually, I managed to pull myself together enough to start driving again, but nothing felt the same after that night. For weeks afterward, I found myself searching for the Midnight Mirage every time I drove through Wyoming. I'd slow down as the clock approached midnight, my eyes scanning the horizon for that telltale glow of neon. But I never saw it again. I've talked to other truckers about it, usually late at night over cups of coffee and normal everyday truck stops. Most laugh it off as a ghost story, a legend of the road. But every once in a while, I'll see a flicker of recognition in someone's eyes. They'll go quiet, maybe take a long sip of coffee to cover their unease. And I know they've seen it too. The truck stop that appears only at midnight, where time doesn't work quite right and the air smells of diesel and destiny. I've spent countless hours trying to make sense of what happened that night. Was it some kind of time slip, a parallel dimension, or something even stranger? I don't have answers, but I know what I saw, what I experienced, and it's changed the way I see the world. Now, every time I'm on the road at night, I find myself watching the clock as it approaches midnight. Part of me hopes I'll never see the midnight mirage again, but another part wonders what would happen if I stayed next time. Where else might those impossible roads lead? One thing's for sure, I'll never look at an empty stretch of highway the same way again, because now I know that in the darkest hours of the night, when the veil between worlds is at its thinnest, strange things can happen. So if you're ever driving late at night and you see a truck stop appear where one shouldn't be, think carefully before you pull in. Because at the midnight mirage, you might find more than just a hot cup of coffee and a clean bathroom. You might find yourself on a journey you never expected, down roads that don't appear on any map. And who knows, maybe someday, if the stars align just right, I'll find my way back there. Back to that impossible truck stop where time stands still and all roads meet. Until then, I'll keep driving, and I'll keep watching for that neon glow on the horizon just as the clock strikes midnight. I used to love driving at night. The empty roads, the starry skies, the sense of being the only person awake in a sleeping world. But that all changed 3 months ago at a gas station just outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, the darkness holds terrors I never knew existed, and the memory of those coal-black eyes haunts my every waking moment. It was a Tuesday night, or maybe Wednesday morning by that point, the kind of hour where time loses all meaning and the world feels slightly unreal. I'd been on the road for 14 hours straight, hauling a load of electronics from Memphis to Albuquerque. My eyes were gritty with fatigue, and the glare of oncoming headlights had long since blurred into a meaningless smear of light. When I saw the sign for Pete's Gas and Go looming out of the darkness, it was like a miracle. My fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty, and my bladder felt ready to burst. I signaled and pulled off the highway, the gravel crunching under my tires as I maneuvered my rig into the deserted lot. The place was eerily quiet. No other vehicles, not even a stray cat prowling around the dumpsters, just rows of silent pumps standing like sentinels under the harsh fluorescent lights. A faded sign in the window proclaimed 24/7 service, but the office looked dark and empty. I climbed down from my cab, wincing as my joints popped in protest. The air was thick and humid, carrying the scent of impending rain. As I stretched, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned, expecting to see the night attendant finally making an appearance. Instead, I saw a child. She was standing by pump number 13, a small figure in a pale blue dress that looked at least 3 decades out of style. Her long dark hair hung limply around her face, and her skin was so pale it seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. For a moment, I just stared. What was a kid doing out here alone at this hour? My paternal instincts kicked in, overriding my exhaustion. "Hey there," I called out, trying to keep my voice gentle. "You okay? Where are your parents?" The girl didn't respond. She didn't even seem to breathe. She just stood there, motionless, her face hidden by her hair. A chill ran down my spine, despite the muggy air. Something was very, very wrong here. I took a step closer, my work boots scraping against the concrete. "Sweetheart, do you need help?" Slowly, so slowly it hardly seemed real, the girl raised her head. I'll never forget what I saw next. It's burned into my memory like a brand. Her eyes were completely black. No whites, no irises, just endless, bottomless pools of darkness that seemed to swallow all light. I staggered backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. The girl, if you could call it that, took a step toward me. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being manipulated by an unskilled puppeteer. "Mister!" Her voice was high and sweet, a parody of childish innocence. "Can you help me? I'm lost." Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get back in my truck and drive as fast and as far as I could, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from those terrible eyes. "My mommy's gone," the thing said, taking another lurching step forward. "Can you take me to her?" I found my voice, though it came out as little more than a hoarse whisper. "Stay back." It cocked its head to one side, an eerily bird-like motion. "Don't you want to help me?" A smile spread across its face, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp, a little too numerous. Everyone wants to help a lost little girl. I began to back away, fumbling for the door of my truck. The thing's smile widened, stretching beyond the bounds of what should have been physically possible. "Where are you going?" it asked, its voice deepening, losing its childish quality. "Don't leave me all alone out here. It's not safe for a little girl." My back hit the side of my truck. I groped blindly for the handle, my eyes still fixed on the approaching figure. It was only a few feet away now, close enough that I could smell a sickly sweet odor emanating from it, like rotting fruit. "Help me!" it suddenly shrieked, the sound so loud and inhuman that I felt it reverberate in my bones. In that moment, its face seemed to ripple, revealing something ancient and malevolent beneath the childlike facade. I don't remember opening the door or climbing into the cab. The next thing I knew, I was peeling out of the gas station, my tires squealing on the asphalt. In my rearview mirror, I saw the thing standing in the middle of the lot, watching me go. As I turned back onto the highway, I could have sworn I heard laughter, high and cruel, cutting through the night. I drove for hours, my hands shaking on the wheel, too terrified to stop. When the sun finally rose, I pulled over at a busy truck stop, surrounded by the comforting sounds of human activity. It was only then that I realized I'd left without filling up my tank or paying for the gas I'd pumped. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those bottomless black orbs staring back at me. I jumped at every shadow, flinched at the sound of children's laughter. More than once, I considered quitting trucking altogether, but bills needed to be paid and driving was the only life I knew. So I stayed on the road, but I made some changes. I don't drive at night anymore if I can help it. I avoid lonely gas stations and always make sure there are other people around when I stop. I've tried to tell myself that it was just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and road hypnosis, that there's no such thing as black-eyed children or monsters disguised as little girls. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things out there in the darkness, things that defy explanation or understanding, things that wear familiar faces to lure us in, only to reveal horrors beyond imagining. I've talked to other truckers about what happened, usually late at night over cups of coffee that do little to ward off the chill of remembering. Most laugh it off as a ghost story, a legend of the road. But every once in a while, I'll see a flicker of recognition in someone's eyes, a tightening around their mouth. And I know they've seen something too, something that doesn't fit into the orderly world we pretend we live in. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd taken its hand, if I'd agreed to help it. Where would it have led me? What would I have seen? There's a part of me, a small, insane part, that almost wishes I had, just to know. But mostly I'm grateful. Grateful that whatever survival instinct kicked in that night was stronger than my curiosity or my misguided desire to help. Grateful that I'm still here, still human, still myself. I don't know what that thing at the gas station was. A ghost? A demon? Some entity beyond our comprehension? I don't think I want to know. But I do know this. The world is stranger and more dangerous than most people realize. There are things lurking in the shadows, waiting for the unwary or the unlucky. So if you're ever driving late at night and you see a lonely child standing by the side of the road, don't stop. Don't roll down your window. Don't make eye contact. Just drive as fast and as far as you can. Because it might not be a child at all. It might be something wearing a child's skin with eyes like bottomless pits and a hunger that can never be satisfied. And if you do stop, if you do look into those eyes, well, I hope you're faster than I was. I hope you're stronger. Because once you've seen what's really out there in the darkness, you can never unsee it, and it never ever stops looking back. They say the desert has a way of playing tricks on your mind. The endless expanse of sand and sky, the shimmering heat mirages, the eerie silence that seems to swallow all sound. But what happened to me out there in the Mojave wasn't a trick of the light or a hallucination brought on by dehydration. The claw marks etched into the side of my truck were all too real, and they've left scars on my psyche that run far deeper than mere scratches in paint and metal. It was supposed to be a routine haul, Phoenix to Los Angeles, a trip I'd made 100 times before. But as I pulled out of the truck stop just outside of Kingman, Arizona, I had a feeling in my gut that something was off. Maybe it was the way the setting sun painted the sky in shades of blood and bruise, or how the wind whispered through the Joshua trees like a warning. Whatever it was, it set my teeth on edge and had me gripping the steering wheel just a little too tight. Night fell quickly, as it often does in the desert. One moment the horizon was ablaze with the last dying embers of daylight. The next I was plunged into a darkness so complete it felt like I was driving through a void. The headlights of my Peterbilt carved a tunnel through the blackness, illuminating a world that seemed to exist only within that narrow beam. I'd been driving for about 2 hours when I first heard it, a sound so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. A scraping noise like nails on a chalkboard coming from somewhere outside the cab. I turned down the radio, straining my ears. For a long moment there was nothing but the steady hum of tires on asphalt and the rumble of the engine. Then I heard it again, louder this time, a harsh, grating sound that set my teeth on edge and sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced at my side mirrors, half expecting to see some creature clinging to the side of my truck, but there was nothing there, just the empty road stretching out behind me. The sound came again, and this time there was no mistaking it. Something was scratching at the outside of my cab. My heart began to race, pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I increased my speed, pushing the big rig as fast as I dared on the winding desert highway. The scratching intensified, becoming a frenzied scrabbling that seemed to come from all around me. I spotted a pull-off ahead, a wide shoulder bathed in the sickly glow of a lone streetlight. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel hard to the right, the truck's air brakes hissing as I brought the rig to a shuddering stop. For a long moment I just sat there, my hands shaking on the wheel, listening. The night was silent again, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Slowly, hesitantly, I reached for the door handle. A voice in the back of my mind screamed at me to stay put, to lock the doors and call for help. But I had to know, I had to see. The desert air hit me like a slap as I stepped down from the cab, bringing with it the sense of sage and creosote. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam pathetically small against the vast darkness surrounding me. What I saw next nearly stopped my heart. The entire passenger side of my truck was covered in deep, jagged grooves. They ran from the front fender all the way back to the sleeper cab, some as long as my arm, others short and frenzied like the marks of a desperate animal trying to claw its way inside. I approached slowly, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. The scratches were deep, gouging through the paint and well into the metal beneath. Whatever had made them was powerful, far stronger than any desert creature I knew of. As I ran my fingers over the marks, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. The edges of the grooves were warm to the touch, as if they had been carved only moments ago. A sudden sound behind me made me whirl around, my heart leaping into my throat. But it was just a piece of tumbleweed skittering across the asphalt, pushed by the desert wind that had begun to pick up. I played the flashlight beam across the empty landscape, half expecting to see some monstrous shape lurking just beyond the circle of light. But there was nothing. Just endless desert stretching out in all directions, silent and indifferent to my fear. I climbed back into the cab on shaky legs, slamming and locking the door behind me. As I sat there trying to calm my racing heart, a thought struck me that made my blood run cold. Whatever had made those marks had been clawing at the cab while I was driving, while I was inside. The implication was too terrifying to contemplate. I started the engine with trembling hands, the familiar rumble providing little comfort. As I pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something out there in the darkness was following me, waiting for another chance to what? Get inside? The thought made me shudder. I drove through the rest of the night in a state of hyper-alertness, my eyes constantly darting to the mirrors, my ears straining for any sound over the roar of the engine. But there was nothing. No more scratching, no shapes looming out of the darkness. By the time the first fingers of dawn began to creep over the eastern horizon, I had almost convinced myself that it had all been some kind of waking nightmare. Almost. As I pulled into the truck stop on the outskirts of Barstow, the rising sun revealed the full extent of the damage to my rig. In the harsh light of day, the claw marks looked even more brutal, more impossible. A small crowd of other drivers gathered around, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. "What the hell happened to you out there, buddy?" one of them asked. running his hand over the deepest of the gouges. I opened my mouth to explain, then closed it again. How could I possibly describe what had happened? Who would believe me? Must have sideswiped something, I muttered, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. Guess I'm more tired than I thought. The other driver gave me a look that said he didn't buy it for a second, but he didn't press the issue. Nobody did. In our line of work, you learn pretty quick that some things are better left unspoken. I called my dispatcher and told him I needed a few days off. Personal emergency, I said. He wasn't happy, but something in my voice must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation because he didn't argue. I spent 3 days holed up in a cheap motel room, barely sleeping, jumping at every sound. When I finally worked up the courage to go back on the road, I made sure it was a daytime run. I haven't driven at night since. It's been 6 months since that night in the Mojave. The scratches on my truck have been repaired, the metal smoothed out and repainted until there's no visible trace of what happened. But I know they're there, hidden beneath the surface, just like the scars I carry inside. I've tried to convince myself that there's a logical explanation for what happened. Maybe I did sideswipe something and my mind, addled by fatigue and the tricks of the desert night, turned it into something more sinister. But deep down, I know that's not true. Something was out there that night, something that defied explanation or understanding, something that wanted in. I still drive the long-haul routes, still make my way across the vast expanses of the American West. But things are different now. I don't linger at remote rest stops. I don't pull over on lonely stretches of highway no matter how tired I am, and I never ever drive through the desert at night. Because now I know the truth that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. We're not alone out there. There are things in this world that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, things that come out when the sun goes down and the shadows grow long. And sometimes, if you're very unlucky, those things take an interest in you. So if you're ever driving through the desert in the dark of night and you hear a sound like claws scraping against metal, don't stop, don't investigate. Just drive as fast as you can and pray that whatever's out there doesn't catch up to you. Because once it's marked you, like it marked me, you'll never feel truly safe in the darkness again. They say you should keep your eyes on the road, but it's what I saw in my rearview mirror that night on Route 50 that nearly killed me. It's been 3 years since that hellish drive across Nevada, and I still wake up in a cold sweat. The image of that thing burned into my retinas like an afterimage from staring at the sun. But the sun brings warmth and life. What I saw in my mirror that night was cold, ancient, and hungry. I'd been driving for nearly 16 hours straight, hauling a load of electronics from Sacramento to Denver. The Nevada desert stretched out around me, an endless sea of scrubland and salt flats under a canopy of stars so bright and numerous they looked fake, like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. It was the kind of night where the line between reality and dream blurs, where the mind starts to play tricks on you. At least that's what I told myself when I first noticed something odd in my rearview mirror. At first, it was just a flicker of movement, so quick I thought I'd imagined it. But then I saw it again. A shadow darker than the night itself, shifting and writhing in the space behind my trailer. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision. When I looked again, it was gone. I chalked it up to fatigue and way too much gas station coffee. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. I turned up the radio, trying to drown out the sudden silence that seemed to press in from all sides. That's when I saw it again. This time there was no mistaking it. Something was back there, something big. In the dim red glow of my taillights, I could make out a shape that defied description. It seemed to flow rather than move, its form constantly shifting and changing. One moment it looked almost human, the next it was something utterly alien, all twisted limbs and too many angles. My heart began to race, pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I pressed down on the accelerator, the big rig's engine roaring as I pushed it to its limits. The creature in my mirror kept pace effortlessly, its impossible form undulating with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion, a trick of the light combined with my exhausted mind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Whatever was behind me was real, and it was getting closer. The miles flew by in a blur of panic and adrenaline. I didn't dare take my eyes off the road for more than a second at a time, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing in the mirror every few moments. Each time I looked, the thing seemed larger, more defined. I could make out details now that I wished I couldn't. Eyes that glowed with an inner light, a maw filled with teeth like broken glass, limbs that bent in ways that shouldn't be possible. And all the while it was watching me. I could feel its gaze boring into the back of my skull, filled with a hunger that was ancient and insatiable. I don't know how long I drove like that, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my body rigid with terror. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The desert night stretched on forever, an endless ribbon of asphalt unspooling before me while that nightmarish thing pursued me relentlessly. I was so focused on what was behind me that I almost missed the lights ahead. A truck stop materialized out of the darkness like a mirage, its neon signs a beacon of hope in the vast emptiness. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel hard, nearly jackknifing as I swerved into the parking lot. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop in a cloud of dust and the smell of burning rubber. For a long moment, I just sat there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unfasten my seatbelt. Slowly, terrified of what I might see, I raised my eyes to the rearview mirror. Nothing. The lot behind me was empty, just cracked asphalt and flickering fluorescent lights. I let out a shaky laugh that sounded more like a sob. It had all been in my head after all. Just a hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road and not enough sleep. I slumped forward, resting my forehead against the steering wheel, relief washing over me in waves. That's when I heard it. A sound like wet leather being stretched and torn, coming from directly above me. I looked up, and in that moment I knew true terror. It was on the roof of my cab, its form draped over the top like some kind of hideous mollusk. Tendrils of darkness oozed down the windshield, leaving trails of something that looked disturbingly like oil, but smelled of rot and decay. Its eyes, God, its eyes, were inches from mine. Depthless pools of hunger that seemed to pull at my very soul. I screamed. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I screamed like I've never screamed before, a primal sound of pure animal terror that tore at my throat and echoed in the empty lot. What happened next is a blur. I remember fumbling with the door handle, nearly falling out of the cab in my desperation to get away. I remember running, my legs pumping so hard they felt like they might shatter, my lungs burning as I gulped in the cold desert air. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that when I finally stopped, my legs giving out beneath me, I found myself in the middle of the truck stop diner, surrounded by startled faces and the smell of burned coffee. "You okay, buddy?" A grizzled old trucker had his hand on my shoulder, his face a mask of concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to tell him what had happened, but no words came out. How could I possibly explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? I'm fine," I managed to croak out. Just a bad dream, I guess." The old trucker didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. He helped me to a booth and bought me a cup of coffee, strong and bitter and blessedly normal. I sat there until dawn, jumping at every shadow, flinching at every sound. When the sun finally rose, painting the desert in shades of gold and pink, I felt some of the terror begin to recede. In the harsh light of day, what I'd seen seemed impossible, a nightmare born of an overtired mind in the lonely desert night. But when I finally worked up the courage to go back to my truck, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the roof of my cab, was a stain, a large, oddly shaped patch where the paint had been eaten away, the metal beneath pitted and corroded as if by some powerful acid. I quit trucking that day, sold my rig, moved to a small town in the mountains where the nights are never truly dark and the roads are never truly empty. But no matter how far I run, I can't escape the memory of what I saw in that rearview mirror. Sometimes, late at night when the wind howls around my little house, I think I hear something moving outside, something big, something hungry. And when I catch a glimpse of my reflection in a darkened window, for just a moment I see those eyes again, staring back at me from a face that isn't my own. They say you should keep your eyes on the road, but sometimes what's behind you is far more dangerous than what's ahead. So if you're ever driving late at night and you see something strange in your rearview mirror, something that shouldn't be there, don't look again. Don't slow down, just drive and pray that it doesn't catch up to you. Because once it's seen you, it will never stop following. And you don't want to know what happens if it catches you. Trust me, I know. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 2 decades, and I thought I'd seen it all. Hitchhikers, lot lizards, highway patrol with chips on their shoulders, you name it, I've dealt with it. But nothing in all my years on the road could have prepared me for that night in Montana, or the passenger who climbed into my cab and proceeded to turn my world upside down. It was a Friday night in late October, the kind of autumn evening where the chill in the air carries the promise of the coming winter. I was hauling a load of farm equipment from Billings to Seattle, fighting to keep my eyes open as the endless ribbon of I-90 stretched out before me. The dashboard clock read 11:43 p.m. when I saw the figure on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just another hitchhiker, probably some college kid trying to thumb their way across the country. But as I got closer, something about the way they were standing made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. They weren't moving, weren't even trying to flag down a ride. They were just waiting. I don't pick up hitchhikers as a rule. Too dangerous in this day and age. But something compelled me to slow down. Maybe it was the lateness of the hour, or the fact that we were miles from the nearest town. Or maybe it was those eyes gleaming in the reflection of my headlights that seemed to bore right into my soul. Before I knew what I was doing, I was pulling over onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires as I came to a stop. The figure approached my cab, and I got my first good look at them. It was a man, or at least something that looked like a man. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark suit that seemed out of place on the side of a highway in the middle of nowhere. His face was pale, almost luminous in the moonlight, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that were just a little too large, a little too bright. "Evening, friend," he said as he opened the passenger door. His voice was smooth, cultured, with an accent I couldn't quite place. "Mind if I catch a ride?" Every instinct I had was screaming at me to put the truck in gear and get the hell out of there, but instead I heard myself say, "Hop in." He climbed into the cab with a fluid grace that seemed almost inhuman. As he settled into the passenger seat, I caught a whiff of something that made my nose wrinkle. Not body odor or bad breath, but something older, mustier, like the inside of a long-sealed tomb. "Much obliged," he said, fixing those unnerving eyes on me. "It's a long, lonely road out here at night." I grunted in agreement and pulled back onto the highway, trying to ignore the way my skin was crawling. We drove in silence for a few miles, the only sound the rumble of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. "So," I said finally, desperate to break the tension, "where you headed?" He smiled, a gesture that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, I'm going wherever you are, John." I felt my blood run cold. I hadn't told him my name. "How did you know your name?" he finished for me. "I know a lot of things, John. I know you've been driving trucks for 23 years, 4 months, and 16 days. I know you have a daughter named Sarah who hasn't spoken to you in 5 years. And I know that every night you dream about the accident that wasn't your fault, but that you blame yourself for anyway." My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to keep it steady. He chuckled, a sound that was utterly devoid of humor. "Who I am isn't important. What's important is who you are, John, and what you're going to do." "What I'm going to do?" I repeated, feeling like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. "Yes," he said, leaning towards me. I could feel his breath on my cheek, cold as a winter wind. "You see, John, you're at a crossroads. The choices you make in the next few hours will determine not just the course of your life, but the lives of many others." I wanted to tell him he was crazy, to stop the truck and throw him out, but something in his voice, in those eyes that seemed to see right through me, held me paralyzed. "There's a storm coming," he continued. "Not just a physical storm, though that's part of it. A storm of events, of choices and consequences, and you, John, are right at the center of it." As if on cue, I saw the first flash of lightning in the distance, illuminating angry clouds that hadn't been there moments before. The wind picked up, buffeting the truck. "In exactly 47 minutes, the stranger said, his voice taking on a rhythmic, almost hypnotic quality, "you're going to come across an overturned car on the side of the road. There will be a woman inside, injured but alive. What you do in that moment will set in motion a chain of events that will ripple out far beyond this night, far beyond this stretch of highway." I opened my mouth to speak, but he held up a hand, silencing me. "If you stop to help her, you'll save her life. She'll go on to become a brilliant scientist, developing a cure for a disease that would have otherwise killed millions. But in stopping, you'll be delayed. You'll miss your delivery window, lose your job, and eventually, in your desperation, turn to drinking. You'll die alone and forgotten in a cheap motel room 5 years from now. I felt sick to my stomach. The familiar guilt over the accident I'd been involved in years ago mixing with a new, terrifying sense of responsibility. If you don't stop, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, the woman will die. But you'll make your delivery, keep your job, and eventually reconcile with your daughter. You'll live to see your grandchildren born and die peacefully in your sleep at the age of 82. The storm was getting closer now, rain beginning to pelt the windshield. I gripped the wheel tighter, feeling like I was standing on the edge of a precipice. Why are you telling me this? I managed to choke out. Why me? He turned those unsettling eyes on me again, and for a moment I saw something ancient and unfathomable in their depths. Because, John, sometimes the fate of the world hinges on the choices of one ordinary person. Sometimes a truck driver on a lonely highway can change the course of history. We drove on in silence after that, the storm raging around us. I kept glancing at the clock, watching as the minutes ticked inexorably towards the moment of choice. At exactly 12:30 a.m., I saw the overturned car. Time seemed to slow down. I could see the woman inside, just as he'd said. She was moving weakly, clearly injured. I hovered my foot over the brake pedal, my heart pounding in my ears. I looked over at the passenger seat, but it was empty. The stranger was gone, as if he'd never been there at all. Had I imagined the whole thing? But I could still hear his voice in my head, laying out the two possible futures before me. Save a life and doom myself, or secure my own happiness at the cost of another's life, and potentially millions more. The choice loomed before me, as vast and inescapable as the storm-racked sky above. In that moment, I understood what he'd meant about ordinary people changing the course of history. I'd never felt so small, yet so incredibly important. I made my choice. I've replayed that night in my mind 1,000 times since then, wondering if I did the right thing, wondering if the stranger was real, if everything he'd told me was true. Some days I convinced myself it was all a hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road and not enough sleep. But then I'll catch a news story about a medical breakthrough, or I'll get a call from my daughter, and I'll remember. I'll remember the stranger's eyes, the weight of the choice he laid before me, the storm that raged around us as I drove towards my destiny. I don't know if I changed the world that night. I don't know if I saved millions of lives or if I just made a simple choice to help someone in need. But I do know this. Every choice we make, no matter how small it might seem, has the potential to change everything. So the next time you're driving down a dark, lonely highway and you see someone in need, think carefully about what you do next. Because you never know, your choice might just shape the fate of the world. And if you ever pick up a passenger who seems to know more than they should, who speaks of choices and consequences with an authority that chills you to your bones, well, listen carefully. You might just be on the brink of changing history. They call it the Echo Strip, that 20-mile stretch of Highway 13 just south of Millbrook. Truckers avoid it if they can, especially after dark. But sometimes when you're on a deadline and the diesel's running low, you don't have a choice. That's how I found myself driving down that godforsaken road at 2 a.m. with nothing but my high beams and a bad feeling in my gut for company. I'd heard the stories, of course, who hasn't? The whispers in truck stops, the warnings passed over CB radio. They say the accidents there don't just happen, they repeat, like echoes bouncing off canyon walls, playing the same tragedy over and over again. I never believed it. Chalked it up to lot lizards trying to spook greenhorns or old-timers who'd been on the road too long. But belief, I learned that night, ain't got nothing to do with what's real. The fog rolled in about 5 miles into the Echo Strip, thick as pea soup and twice as disorienting. 1 second the road was clear, the next I could barely see past my hood ornament. I eased off the gas, squinting into the gloom. The white lines on the road blurred, seeming to shift and dance in my headlights. That's when I saw it. A pair of taillights ahead, dim and flickering like dying fireflies. Relief washed over me. Another truck maybe, or a late-night traveler. Either way, something to focus on, to follow through this soup. I closed the distance slowly, carefully. But no matter how close I got, those taillights stayed just out of reach, always the same distance ahead. It wasn't natural. I felt the first real stirrings of fear then, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Suddenly the taillights swerved violently to the right. I hit the brakes instinctively, my rig shuddering as the tires fought for grip on the wet asphalt. Through the fog, I caught a glimpse of something. A car, maybe, or what was left of one. It was upside down in the ditch, wheels still spinning lazily in the air. I pulled over, heart pounding, grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the mist. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted metal and shattered glass. But as I got closer, something wasn't right. The car, an old model, maybe from the 70s, looked faded somehow, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding muffled in the thick air. "Anyone there? You okay?" No answer, just the soft tick-tick-tick of a cooling engine and the distant hum of crickets. I approached cautiously, playing my light over the wreck. And that's when I saw him. The driver, hanging upside down in his seatbelt, blood matting his hair and dripping slowly onto the roof of the car. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. Fumbled for my phone to call 911, but before I could dial, something made me look up. The fog was changing, thinning in places, swirling in others, and through those gaps I saw echoes, ghostly images playing out like a movie reel stuck on repeat. A car, the same car driving down the highway, swerving to avoid something, flipping over and over before coming to rest in the ditch. The same accident, happening again and again and again. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, just stood there watching this impossible scene unfold. And then slowly the images faded. The fog closed in again, thicker than ever. When I looked back at the wrecked car, it was gone. No twisted metal, no broken glass, not even a tire track in the mud. Just empty roadside, like nothing had ever happened. I ran back to my truck, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. Threw it into gear and got the hell out of there, pushing that rig harder than I ever had before. Didn't stop until I was 50 miles clear of the Echo Strip, pulled over at a brightly lit truck stop that had never looked so welcoming. Sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion, just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew. Knew that I'd seen something that night that didn't fit into the normal world. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake it. That image of the accident repeating over and over haunted my dreams. I found myself obsessing over it, researching the history of Highway 13 whenever I had downtime. Turned out there was a reason they called it the Echo Strip. Back in '78, there'd been a massive pileup there. Fog rolled in suddenly, caught everyone by surprise. When it cleared, there were 12 wrecked vehicles scattered along that stretch of road. 17 dead, including a young family in a car that matched the one I'd seen. The official report blamed it on the weather and driver error. But there were whispers, even back then. Truckers who swore they'd seen the accidents happen over and over in the fog. Most folks wrote them off as trauma, survivors unable to cope with what they'd seen. But I knew better now. Those echoes, those repeating accidents, they were real. As real as the asphalt under my wheels or the coffee in my thermos. For a while I avoided Highway 13 altogether, took the long way around even if it cost me time and fuel. But you can only run for so long in this business. Eventually a job came up that I couldn't turn down, one that meant taking the Echo Strip or breaking contract. So there I was again, white-knuckling the wheel as I approached that haunted stretch of road. The fog rolled in right on cue, thick and unnatural. I felt my heart rate spike, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool air. This time, though, I was ready. I'd talked to other drivers who'd been through it, gathered every scrap of information I could. Some said if you drove slow enough, you could pass through without seeing anything. Others swore that playing loud music kept the echoes at bay. Me? I decided to face it head on. I kept my speed steady, eyes locked on the road ahead. And when I saw those flickering taillights appear in the mist, I didn't shy away. "I see you," I said out loud, my voice sounding strange in the quiet cab. "I know what happened to you, and I'm sorry." The taillights wavered like a mirage in the desert. For a moment I thought they might vanish, but then they steadied, staying a constant distance ahead of me. I followed them through the fog, watching as the echo played out again. The swerve, the flip, the terrible crash. But this time I didn't look away. I watched it all, bearing witness to that long-ago tragedy. As the last echoes faded, I could have sworn I saw something else. A flicker of movement by the side of the road. A family, man, woman, and child standing hand in hand. They turned towards me, and I felt a moment of pure, inexplicable connection. Then they were gone, fading into the mist like morning dew under a hot sun. The fog lifted as suddenly as it had appeared. I was through the echo strip, the open road stretching out ahead of me. My hands were shaking on the wheel, tears stinging my eyes, but I felt lighter somehow, like I'd passed some kind of test. I've driven the echo strip many times since that night. Sometimes I see the echoes, sometimes I don't. But I'm not afraid of them anymore. I understand now that they're not there to harm us. They're memories, imprinted on that stretch of road like grooves on a record, playing over and over, waiting for someone to listen. So now when other drivers ask me about Highway 13, I don't try to scare them with ghost stories. I tell them the truth that sometimes the past echoes into the present. And if you're brave enough to listen, you might just learn something about yourself. Because that's the real secret of the echo strip. It's not just about witnessing someone else's tragedy. It's about facing your own fears, your own regrets. It's about realizing that we're all connected, all part of some greater story that's still unfolding. And maybe, just maybe, by bearing witness to these echoes of the past, we can help lay them to rest. 1 mile at a time, one driver at a time, until the day when that stretch of Highway 13 is just another road, and those long-ago victims can finally find peace. Until then, I'll keep driving, keep watching, keep listening, because someone has to. And out here on the long, dark highways of America, it might as well be me. The closed sign flickered to life just as I pulled up to the Dry Creek way station. Typical. 5 more minutes and I would have been in the clear, legal, and documented. Now I was looking at a choice between an overweight fine or sitting idle until morning. Neither option appealed to my wallet or my schedule. I drummed my fingers on the steering wheel, eyeing the empty booth. The logical part of my brain said to keep moving, find somewhere to park for the night. But 20 years on the road had taught me that sometimes you gotta bend the rules a little to make ends meet. Screw it, I muttered, easing off the brake. The rig lurched forward, tires crunching on loose gravel as I guided it onto the scale. Just a quick way in, I told myself, in and out before anyone could spot me. The station was eerily quiet as I climbed down from the cab, my boots hitting the pavement with a dull thud that seemed to echo in the still night air. A single floodlight cast long shadows across the lot, transforming familiar shapes into looming monsters. I shook off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Just nerves, I told myself. Nothing more. The booth door was locked, of course, but I knew the trick. A little jiggle, a firm push, and it swung open with a protesting creak. The stale air inside hit me like a wall, heavy with the ghosts of 1,000 cigarettes. I fumbled for the light switch, wincing as harsh fluorescence flickered to life. Everything looked normal at first glance. Outdated computer, stack of forms, half-empty coffee mug sporting a faded dot logo. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something off. The mug wasn't covered in dust like you'd expect. In fact, it looked recently used, a brown ring still visible around the inside. A chill ran down my spine, raising goosebumps on my arms despite the stuffy air. Someone had been here, recently. I pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. The sooner I got this done, the sooner I could be back on the road, putting this creepy place in my rearview mirror. The ancient computer whirred to life reluctantly. I tapped my foot impatiently, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen. That's when I heard it. A soft thud from somewhere outside the booth. My head snapped up, heart suddenly pounding. Through the grimy window, I could see my rig sitting silent on the scale. Nothing else moved in the pools of light cast by the flood lamps. Must have been an animal, I told myself. Probably a raccoon rooting through the trash. But I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, watching from just beyond the circle of light. The computer chimed, startling me. The weigh-in program was finally loaded. I punched in my information with shaky fingers, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Another thud, louder this time, close. Too close to be anything but deliberate. I froze, finger hovering over the enter key. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the quiet hum of the computer and my own ragged breathing. "Hello?" I called out, hating the way my voice cracked. "Someone there?" No answer. Just that oppressive silence. I turned back to the computer, determined to finish what I'd started. But as I reached for the keyboard, I caught a flicker of movement in the reflection on the screen. A dark shape just outside the booth door. I whirled around, heart in my throat. The doorway was empty, nothing but inky blackness beyond. But I could have sworn. The floodlight outside flickered, once, twice. In that stuttering illumination, I saw it. A figure standing motionless beside my truck. Tall, impossibly thin, its proportions all wrong for a human. In the split second before darkness fell again, I locked eyes with it. Cold, dead eyes that glowed with an inner light fixed directly on me. I stumbled backward, colliding with the desk. The coffee mug toppled, shattering on the floor. In that moment of distraction, the light steadied, and the figure was gone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the door handle. I burst out of the booth, gulping in the cool night air. The lot was empty, silent. No sign of the thing I'd seen. I made it back to my rig in record time, scraping my shin on the step in my haste to climb into the cab. The key was in the ignition before I'd even fully settled into the seat. As the engine roared to life, I caught movement in my side mirror. A flash of pale skin, those glowing eyes, then it was gone, quick as a blink. I threw the truck into gear and peeled out of there, tires squealing in protest. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I didn't slow down until the way station was miles behind me, nothing but a bad memory fading in the distance. It wasn't until I pulled into a truck stop 2 hours later that I realized I was still clutching the paperwork from the weigh-in. My hands shook as I unfolded it, not sure what I was expecting to see. There, in faded dot matrix print, were my truck's details. Weight, axle distribution, all the usual stuff. But at the bottom, where the operator's signature should be, was a single line of text that made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't be here." I crumpled the paper, tossed it out the window, told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, fatigue and caffeine, and too many long nights on the road. But deep down, I knew that I'd seen something that night that didn't belong in this world. Something that guarded that lonely way station when the sun went down and all the normal folks had gone home. I've never gone back to Dry Creek. Never will if I have any say in it. These days, I stick to the rules, no matter how tempting it might be to shave a few hours off my route. Because I learned something that night, something I'll never forget. Sometimes the price of bending the rules is higher than any of us are willing to pay. I've told this story a few times over the years, usually late at night in some dingy truck stop when the conversation turns to ghost stories and things that go bump in the night. Most folks laugh it off, tell me I must have been hitting the no-dahs too hard. And maybe they're right. Maybe it was all just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But sometimes I'll catch a look in another driver's eye. A flicker of recognition, quickly hidden. And I know I'm not the only one who's seen things out there on the lonely highways and forgotten byways of this country. We don't talk about it much, us long haulers. It's not good for business, after all. Customers don't want to hear that their goods might be delayed because of some supernatural encounter. But word gets around. Certain stretches of road that everyone avoids after dark. Way stations that always seem to have a technical malfunction right around sunset. And sometimes late at night when the only company is the rumble of your engine and the glow of your dashboard lights, you might hear something on the CB. A warning passed trucker to trucker in hushed tones. Dry Creek's hot tonight. Take the long way round. If you're smart, you'll listen. Because out here on the road, there are things that don't show up on any map. Things that lurk in the shadows between streetlights. In the fog that rolls in too quick and too thick to be natural. Things that wait at empty way stations in the dead of night, ready to remind us that there are rules in this world. Rules that keep us safe, keep us sane. And when we break those rules, even for a moment, we open ourselves up to forces we can't begin to understand. So the next time you're driving late at night and you see a truck pull off at some unmarked exit, or make a sudden detour that adds hours to their journey, don't judge too harshly. We've all got our reasons for the choices we make out here on the long, dark roads. And some of those reasons are best left unspoken, lest we invite the attention of things that should remain in the shadows. As for me, I'll keep driving, keep moving. But you can bet I'll never pull into another closed way station again. Some risks just aren't worth taking, no matter how tight the deadline or how tempting the shortcut. Because in this line of work, getting the job done isn't just about making good time or maximizing your payload. It's about making it home safe at the end of the run. And sometimes that means knowing when to follow the rules and when to leave well enough alone. I should have known better. 23 years behind the wheel, and the first rule they teach you is stick to the routes you know. But when you're running 18 hours behind schedule with a rig full of perishables and a dispatcher breathing down your neck, sometimes you make bad choices. That's how I found myself turning off the familiar asphalt of Highway 41 onto a narrow dirt road that snaked into the densest, darkest woods I'd ever seen. It started with a rumor, whispered over lukewarm coffee at a truck stop just outside of Millhaven. An old-timer with eyes like faded denim leaned in close, his breath sour with cheap cigarettes. "You want to shave 6 hours off your run to Crestfall? Take the old logging road off mile marker 237. Cut straight through the whispering pines. Ain't on no map, but it'll get you there." I should have laughed it off. Should have known that any shortcut promising to cut that much time was too good to be true. But desperation makes fools of us all. The turnoff was exactly where he said it would be. A gap in the trees barely wide enough for my rig. The sign was so faded I almost missed it. Whispering Pines Lumber Company, no unauthorized vehicles. Well, I figured no one around to authorize or unauthorize me now. The first few miles weren't so bad. The road was rough, pitted with potholes and overgrown in places, but nothing my rig couldn't handle. The trees pressed in close on either side, branches scraping against the cab like bony fingers. But hey, a shortcut's a shortcut, right? It was when the sun started to set that things got weird. The shadows between the trees seemed to deepen, to move in ways that shadows shouldn't. More than once I could have sworn I saw faces peering out at me from the gloom, gone the moment I tried to focus on them. I flipped on the radio, hoping for some company, but all I got was static. Not even a hint of a signal out here in the backwoods. The silence pressed in, broken only by the rumble of my engine and the creak of branches overhead. That's when I noticed the mile markers. Old wooden posts, weathered and gray, popping up every so often along the roadside. But something was off about them. The first one I passed read mile 1. Fair enough. But the next one, maybe half a mile later, read mile 13. The one after that? Mile 42. My grip tightened on the wheel. This wasn't right. None of this was right. But turning around on this narrow track was impossible. The only way out was through. The trees were changing too, the familiar pines and oaks giving way to twisted, gnarled things I couldn't name. Their branches reached out over the road, forming a canopy so thick I could barely see the sky. It was like driving through a tunnel, the darkness broken only by my headlights. And then I saw her. A figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated in my high beams. For a moment I thought it was a deer. We get a lot of those out here. But as I drew closer, I realized it was a woman. She was facing away from me, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow in the darkness. Her hair was long and black, hanging down her back in a tangled mess. I laid on the horn, but she didn't move, didn't even flinch. I was bearing down on her fast, too fast to stop this rig in time. "Move!" I shouted, as if she could hear me through the windshield. "Get out of the way!" At the last possible second, I wrenched the wheel hard to the right. The rig shuddered, tires skidding on the loose gravel. I felt the trailer start to jackknife, the whole world tilting crazily as I fought for control. Then, just as suddenly, it was over. The rig steadied, tires finding purchase once more. I was breathing hard, heart pounding in my chest, but I'd missed her. I was sure I'd missed her. Until I looked in my side mirror and saw her standing there right next to my cab. She turned her head slowly, impossibly, to look directly at me. Her face, God, her face, it was wrong somehow, like a child's drawing of a face with two wide eyes and a mouth that stretched from ear to ear. I didn't think, didn't breathe, just stomped on the gas, the engine roaring as I tore down that godforsaken road as fast as I dared. I don't know how long I drove like that. Minutes, hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in those woods. The mile markers kept coming, each one more impossible than the last. Mile 99, mile 237, mile 1056. It was like the road was stretching out beneath me, going on forever. And all the while I kept seeing her. Glimpses in my mirrors, flashes of white in the trees. Always there, always watching, always smiling that terrible, impossible smile. I was on the verge of panic, ready to abandon the rig and take my chances on foot when I saw it. A break in the trees ahead, a hint of open sky. I pushed the engine harder, praying to whatever might be listening that this nightmare was almost over. The trees fell away suddenly and I burst out onto open road. Real road with asphalt and painted lines and everything. I checked my GPS, hardly daring to believe it. Somehow, impossibly, I was just outside Crestfall. 6 hours of driving time, gone in what felt like minutes. I pulled over at the first rest stop I saw, legs shaking so bad I could barely climb down from the cab. The normal sounds of the highway, passing cars, distant trucks had never sounded so beautiful. As the adrenaline faded, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel, dreamed the whole thing up. But when I walked around to check the trailer, my blood ran cold. There, scratched into the dust on the side of the rig, was a crude drawing of a face. Those two wide eyes, that impossibly wide smile. And beneath it, words that made my skin crawl. Thanks for the ride. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who'd believe me? Hell, most days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I've never taken another shortcut, no matter how behind schedule I am. And I always stick to the main roads. Because out there in the backwoods, in the places that aren't on any map, there are things waiting, things that don't take kindly to trespassers. Things that might just hitch a ride if you're not careful. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving a lonely stretch of highway, I'll catch a glimpse of something white in my mirror, a flash of movement in the trees by the roadside, and for just a moment I'll feel that same paralyzing fear I felt on that impossible road through the whispering pines. But I keep driving, keep moving forward, because in this line of work, that's all you can do. You can't outrun your fears, can't hide from the things that lurk in the shadows. All you can do is keep your eyes on the road ahead and hope that when the sun comes up, you'll find yourself back in the world you know. And if sometimes in the dead of night, I hear a whisper from the back of my trailer, a soft laugh or the sound of fingernails scratching against metal, well, I just turn up the radio and press down a little harder on the gas, because some shortcuts aren't worth taking. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled, and some passengers, they're better left behind in the darkness where they belong. So if you're ever out on the road and you see a shortcut that seems too good to be true, do yourself a favor. Stick to the route you know. It might take longer, but trust me, the alternative isn't worth the risk. After all, out here on the long, dark highways of America, the quickest route isn't always the safest. And sometimes the things you find on the road not taken are better left undiscovered. Me? I'll keep driving, keep moving, but you can bet I'll never turn off onto another unmarked road again. Some risks just aren't worth taking, no matter how tight the deadline or how tempting the shortcut. Because in this line of work, getting the job done isn't just about making good time. It's about making it home safe at the end of the run. And sometimes that means knowing when to play it safe and when to leave the unknown roads untraveled. They say the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. But out here on the endless ribbons of asphalt that crisscross this country, nothing's ever that simple. Especially not when it comes to the Stillwater Bridge. I'd heard whispers about it for years. Truckers passing stories over greasy diner food and burnt coffee. A bridge that defies logic, that stretches on far longer than it should. Some say it's a government experiment gone wrong. Others claim it's a tear in the fabric of reality. Me? I always thought it was just another tall tale, the kind we tell to pass the long hours behind the wheel. Until the night I found myself driving across it. It started like any other haul. A load of electronics bound for Millbrook, a route I'd driven 100 times before. But a massive pileup on the interstate forced me to take a detour down winding country roads I'd never seen before. That's how I ended up approaching the Stillwater Bridge just as the sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. The bridge didn't look like much at first glance. Just your standard 2-lane affair stretching across a wide river, its metal trusses silhouetted against the darkening sky. A faded sign proclaimed Stillwater Bridge, S 1923. Below it, someone had spray-painted "Turn Back" in angry red letters. I should have listened. Should have found another way around, even if it meant adding hours to my trip. But I was already behind schedule, and the bridge looked solid enough. What was the worst that could happen? The answer, as it turns out, was plenty. I was about a quarter of the way across when I first noticed something was off. The bridgework above me seemed to be repeating, the same pattern of metal struts passing by over and over again. I chalked it up to tired eyes and the hypnotic effect of the road, but an uneasy feeling started to gnaw at the pit of my stomach. Halfway across, that unease had blossomed into full-blown anxiety. I'd been driving for far too long. The river below should have given way to land by now, but all I could see in my mirrors was an endless expanse of dark water. The dashboard clock read 7:45 p.m., the same time it had shown when I first started across the bridge. I tried the radio, hoping to ground myself with some music or news, but all I got was static. My phone showed no signal. It was like the outside world had ceased to exist, leaving nothing but me, my rig, and this impossible bridge. An hour in, or what felt like an hour, with that frozen clock, and I was fighting down panic. The bridge stretched endlessly before me, vanishing into a bank of fog that hadn't been there before. Behind me, the same scene played out in my mirrors. It was as if I was caught in some kind of loop, driving the same section of bridge over and over again. I thought about stopping, but some primal instinct told me that would be a mistake. That if I stopped moving, I might never start again. So I kept driving, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my eyes straining for any sign of an end to this nightmare. That's when I saw her. A figure standing on the side of the bridge, arm outstretched in the universal hitchhiker's gesture. As I drew closer, I could make out more details. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, wearing clothes that looked like they came straight out of the 1950s. Her face was pale in the wash of my headlights, her eyes dark pools that seemed to swallow the light. Every instinct I had screamed at me to keep driving, to put my foot down on the gas and leave her in my rear view. But something, curiosity, loneliness, or maybe just the maddening sameness of the bridge, made me slow down. I pulled up alongside her, rolling down my window. "You need a ride?" She smiled, and something about that smile sent a shiver down my spine. It was too wide, too knowing, like she had been waiting for me, specifically me. "I've been waiting a long time for someone to ask me that," she said, her voice carrying an echo that shouldn't have been possible in the open air. "Yes, I'd like a ride, all the way to the end." Before I could respond, she was opening the passenger door and climbing in. I hadn't even come to a full stop. She settled into the seat like she belonged there, smoothing her skirt with pale hands. "Drive," she said, still smiling that unnerving smile. And God help me, I did. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, the same scenery passing by outside. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but I couldn't help stealing glances at my passenger. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I could have sworn she flickered, like a bad TV signal. One moment solid, the next transparent enough that I could see the door behind her. "What's happening?" I finally asked, my voice hoarse from disuse. "What is this place?" She turned to look at me, and her eyes were as black as the water below. "This is the in-between," she said. "The space between what was and what will be. We're all just passing through." "But how do we get out?" I asked, hating the note of desperation in my voice. Her smile widened, impossibly wide. "That depends on you," she said. "On how much you're willing to leave behind." Before I could ask what she meant, she pointed ahead. "Look," she said. "The end approaches." And there it was, the far side of the bridge solidifying out of the mist. I felt a surge of relief so strong it left me lightheaded. But as we drew closer, I realized something was wrong. The exit didn't lead to the road I was expecting. Instead, I saw a small town straight out of a 1950s postcard. At the center stood a sign, "Welcome to Stillwater, a nice place to visit, a better place to stay." I turned to my passenger, a question on my lips, but the words died in my throat. She was gone. The seat beside me was empty, as if she had never been there at all. The choice loomed before me. Take the exit into that impossible town, or keep driving and hope that another end would appear. In that moment, I thought of home, of my family waiting for me to return, of all the things I wasn't ready to leave behind. I gripped the wheel tighter and pressed down on the gas. The exit flew by in a blur, and then I was plunging back into the fog. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I had made a terrible mistake, that I was doomed to drive this bridge forever. Then suddenly I was through. The fog cleared, and I found myself on solid ground, the familiar stretch of highway spreading out before me. My GPS crackled back to life, cheerfully informing me that I was just outside Millbrook. According to it, barely an hour had passed since I started across the bridge. I've tried to find the Stillwater Bridge since that night, retraced my route, searched maps, even asked locals in the area, but it's like it never existed. The only proof I have is the lingering scent of 1950s perfume in my cab and the chill that runs down my spine every time I cross a bridge at night. Sometimes when I'm driving late and the road seems to stretch on forever, I catch a glimpse of something in my mirror, a pale face, a wide smile, and I wonder, did I really escape? Or am I still on that endless bridge, dreaming of a return I'll never make? I don't have any answers, but I know this. Some shortcuts aren't worth taking. Some roads are better left untraveled. And if you ever find yourself approaching a bridge as the sun sets and something doesn't feel quite right, turn back. Take the long way home, because sometimes the longest route is the only one that leads back to where you truly belong. You see a lot of strange things out on the road when you've been driving as long as I have. 30 years behind the wheel, and I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found in that abandoned rig off Route 16. It was a run-of-the-mill Tuesday, the kind where the miles blur together and you start to feel like you're driving in your sleep. I was hauling a load of auto parts from Detroit to Tulsa, cutting through the back roads of southern Illinois to avoid the tollways. That's when I saw it, a big Peterbilt 389 cherry red parked on the shoulder with its hazards blinking. Now, normally I'm not one to stop. Time is money in this business, and you can't help everyone. But something about this rig caught my eye. Maybe it was the way it was angled, like it had been pulled over in a hurry. Or maybe it was the fact that I couldn't see anyone moving around it, despite the running lights being on. Whatever it was, I found myself easing off the accelerator, guiding my own truck onto the shoulder behind it. The moment I stepped out of my cab, I knew something was off. It was mid-July, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the asphalt. But as I approached the abandoned truck, the temperature seemed to drop. By the time I reached the driver's side door, I could see my breath misting in front of me. "Hello?" I called out, rapping my knuckles on the door. "Anyone in there? You need some help?" No answer, just the tick-tick-tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of cicadas. I tried the handle, half expecting it to be locked, but it swung open easily, the hinges creaking like they hadn't been oiled in years. The cab was empty, but it looked like the driver had vanished mid-trip. There was an open bag of beef jerky on the passenger seat, a half-empty bottle of Coke in the cup holder. The key was still in the ignition. That's when I noticed the smell. At first, I thought maybe the driver had been hauling meat that had gone bad in the heat, but this was different. Sweeter, somehow. And underneath it all, a coppery tang that made my stomach turn. I should have left then. Should have climbed back in my own rig and called the cops. Let them deal with whatever this was. But curiosity has always been my downfall. I moved around to the back of the truck, that sweet copper smell growing stronger with every step. The trailer doors were slightly ajar, a padlock hanging broken from the latch. With a deep breath, I pulled the doors open. The smell hit me like a physical force, nearly knocking me off my feet, but it was nothing compared to what I saw inside. The trailer was full of things. I couldn't call them bodies, not really. They were too twisted, too wrong, like someone had taken a dozen different animals and people and mashed them together, then left them to rot in the summer heat. But they weren't rotting. They were moving. A mass of limbs, some human, some decidedly not, writhed in the far corner. Eyes blinked open across what might have once been a torso, each one fixing on me with an intelligence that sent ice water running through my veins. And the sounds, God, the sounds. Whimpers and growls and something that might have been words if words could be formed by too many mouths full of too many teeth. I stumbled backward, my feet tangling beneath me. I hit the asphalt hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. But I didn't feel the pain. All I could focus on was the thing in the trailer, the mass of flesh that was now slowly, inexorably moving towards the open doors. A tendril. There's no other word for it, snaked out, questing along the floor of the trailer. It was followed by another and another. They moved with a purpose, reaching for me with a hunger I could feel in the air. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline lending me speed I hadn't had in years. I sprinted for my truck, not daring to look back. The sound of something heavy hitting the asphalt spurred me on, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I all but dove into my cab, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I stomped on the gas, my tires squealing as I peeled away from the shoulder. In my side mirror, I caught a glimpse of something emerging from the abandoned trailer, something huge and wrong and hungry. Then I was around a bend, and it was lost from view. I drove for hours, pushing my rig to its limits. I didn't stop until I hit the Missouri state line, and even then it was only because my hands were shaking too badly to keep the wheel steady. I pulled into a truck stop, my mind reeling. What the hell had I seen? What was that thing? And more importantly, who had put it there? As I sat there trying to make sense of it all, a black SUV pulled up next to me. Two men in dark suits stepped out, their faces expressionless behind mirrored sunglasses. One of them approached my window. "Sir," he said, his voice flat and emotionless, "we need you to come with us." I thought about running, thought about telling them to go to hell, but one look at their faces told me that wasn't an option. They took me to a nondescript building in the middle of nowhere, asked me questions for hours, made me sign papers swearing I'd never speak of what I'd seen, told me it was a matter of national security. When they finally let me go, the sun was rising on a new day. My truck had been moved to the parking lot, my cargo apparently delivered while I was being interrogated. I thought about quitting right then and there, hanging up my keys and finding a nice, safe job where the only monsters I'd have to deal with were the humankind. But this is all I know. The open road, the endless miles, the freedom of being my own boss. So I keep driving, keep moving. But I'm more cautious now. I don't stop for abandoned vehicles anymore, no matter how strange they might seem. And I never ever open a trailer unless I'm absolutely sure of what's inside. Because out here on the long, dark highways of America, you never know what you might find. Sometimes it's just a broken down rig in need of a helping hand. But sometimes it's something else. Something that wasn't meant to be found. I still see it in my dreams sometimes. That writhing mass of flesh and eyes and hunger. I wake up in cold sweats, the phantom smell of copper and sweetness in my nostrils. And in those moments between sleep and waking, I swear I can feel tendrils of something alien and hungry questing through the dark, searching for me. But I keep driving, keep moving forward. Because in this line of work, that's all you can do. You can't outrun your memories, can't hide from the things you've seen. All you can do is keep your eyes on the road ahead and hope that the next mile brings you somewhere safer, somewhere normal. And if sometimes in the dead of night I see a cherry-red Peterbilt in my rearview mirror, well, I just put my foot down on the gas and pray that my load is heavy enough to keep me grounded in this reality. Because some things once seen can never be unseen, and some loads are better left unhauled, no matter how curious you might be. So if you're ever out on the road and you see an abandoned rig that gives you a bad feeling, do yourself a favor, keep driving, don't look back. Because sometimes the things we find when we stop to help are better left undiscovered. After all, out here on the endless highways, not everything that looks like a truck is hauling cargo meant for human eyes. And sometimes the most dangerous things are the ones that look almost, but not quite, like something you recognize. Me? I'll keep driving, keep moving, but you can bet I'll never stop for an abandoned rig again. Some risks just aren't worth taking, no matter how much your curiosity might itch. Because in this line of work, getting the job done isn't just about delivering the load. It's about making it to the end of your run with your sanity intact. And sometimes that means knowing when to keep your doors closed and your eyes on the road ahead. The sound of a child's laughter echoing through an empty rest area at 3 a.m. is something you never forget. Trust me, I know. It was a moonless night in late October, the kind where the darkness seems to swallow everything beyond your headlights. I'd been on the road for 14 hours straight, hauling a load of electronics from Memphis to Phoenix. My eyes were gritty, my back ached, and the sterile glow of the dashboard clock mocked me with every passing minute. 2:47 a.m. I spotted the blue rest area sign glowing in the distance like a beacon. My bladder had been screaming at me for the last hour, and I knew I needed to stretch my legs before I started seeing things that weren't there. You hear stories, you know? Long-haul truckers losing it on these endless stretches of midnight highway. I eased my rig into the deserted parking lot, the brakes hissing as I brought 18 wheels of steel and cargo to a stop. The lot was empty save for a beat-up Winnebago tucked away in the far corner. Probably some retirees catching some shut-eye on their way to warmer climes. Killing the engine, I sat for a moment, letting the sudden silence wash over me. Out here in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in western Oklahoma, I think, the quiet has a weight to it. It presses down on you, makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I grabbed my flashlight and hopped down from the cab, my boots crunching on loose gravel. The air was crisp, carrying that sharp autumn smell of dead leaves and wood smoke from somewhere in the distance. I stretched, feeling my vertebrae pop one by one, then headed for the restroom building. That's when I heard it. A giggle, high and sweet, drifting on the night air. I froze, my hand on the restroom door. Kids out here? At this hour? I swept my flashlight beam across the rest area, half expecting to see some family huddled around a picnic table, having a late-night snack. Nothing, just empty tables and shadows. I shook my head, chalking it up to road fatigue, and pushed into the men's room. The fluorescent lights flickered to life with an angry buzz, harsh white light reflecting off grimy tile. I did my business quick, splashed some water on my face, and headed back out. The giggle came again, louder this time, followed by a chorus of small voices, whispering just at the edge of hearing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast darkness. "Anyone out there?" Silence. I swept my flashlight across the rest area again, this time more slowly. The beam caught something. A flash of pale movement near the tree line at the edge of the property. I squinted, trying to make out what I'd seen. There. A small figure, maybe 4 feet tall, standing motionless between 2 scraggly pines. As my light hit it full on, I realized it was a child. A little girl in a white nightgown, her long dark hair hanging limp around a face I couldn't quite make out. My first thought was that she must be sleepwalking. Maybe her family was in that Winnebago, oblivious that their kid had wandered off. "Hey there," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle. "You okay, sweetheart? Where are your parents?" The girl didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, staring. Just a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. Something was off about this kid. The way she stood, too still, the fact that she was out here alone in the first place. I took a step toward her, and that's when things got weird. She flickered, like an old TV with bad reception. One second she was there, the next she wasn't, then back again. And in that brief moment when she vanished, I saw something else. Something tall and thin, with 2 long arms and fingers like needles. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't happening, couldn't be happening. I was hallucinating, had to be. Too many hours on the road, too much gas station coffee. The girl, if that's what she was, took a step forward. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. "Stay back," I warned, though my voice cracked with fear. She cocked her head to one side, much farther than any human neck should bend. And then she smiled. It was a terrible thing, that smile, too wide, full of teeth that glinted like shards of broken glass in the beam of my flashlight. I ran, sprinted for my truck like the hounds of hell were on my heels. I fumbled with my keys, dropping them once before finally wrenching the door open and hauling myself into the cab. As I slammed the door shut and stabbed the key into the ignition, I risked a glance out the passenger window. The rest area was full of children. Dozens of them, boys and girls, all in white nightclothes, all with that same terrible smile. They stood silently around my truck, staring up at me with black, empty eyes. The engine roared to life, and I threw the rig into gear. I peeled out of that rest stop so fast I'm surprised I didn't leave tire marks burned into the pavement. For miles, I drove with shaking hands, constantly checking my mirrors, terrified I'd see those kids somehow keeping pace with an 18-wheeler doing 80. It wasn't until the sun started peeking over the horizon that I finally began to relax. I pulled into a truck stop just outside Amarillo, my hands still trembling as I cut the engine. I sat there for a long time trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Sleep deprivation and an overly active imagination, that's all it was. Had to be. The alternative was too horrifying to contemplate. Finally, I climbed down from the cab on wobbly legs. I needed coffee, needed to splash some water on my face, needed to be around other people. As I walked toward the truck stop building, something caught my eye. There, stuck to my driver's side door, was a single sheet of paper. Heart pounding, I peeled it off. It was a child's drawing done in crayon. Crude stick figures surrounded a larger rectangle, my truck. And there, in shaky letters at the bottom, "Come play with us again soon." I quit trucking the next day. Found a nice, safe desk job where the only things that go bump in the night are the occasional falling staplers. But I still see those kids sometimes in my dreams. Still hear that high, sweet giggle echoing in the darkness. And I never ever stop at rest areas after midnight. The first time I saw the ghost truck, I thought I was losing my mind. By the third time, I knew it was hunting me. They say the long, lonely highways can play tricks on your mind. After 15 years hauling freight across the country, I thought I'd seen it all. Mirages shimmering on sun-baked asphalt, phantom hitchhikers that vanish when you slow down, even the occasional UFO streaking across the night sky. But nothing could have prepared me for that night on I-80, somewhere in the endless expanse of Nebraska. It was pushing 2 a.m., and I'd been on the road since sunrise. My eyes burned, gritty and raw from staring at the hypnotic rush of white lines. The radio crackled with late-night talk shows, the hosts' voices a lifeline to the waking world as I pushed onwards through the pitch-black night. That's when I first noticed the headlights in my rear view. Nothing unusual about another truck on the interstate, even at this ungodly hour. But something about this one made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was gaining on me fast, too fast. Before I knew it, the grille was filling my mirrors, close enough that I could make out every detail in sharp relief. It was an old Peterbilt 379, cherry red and gleaming like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. But that was impossible. They stopped making that model years ago, and even a well-maintained rig shows its age after a while. I eased over into the right lane, figuring the speed demon could pass me by. But as soon as I changed lanes, so did the Peterbilt. It hung there in my blind spot, pacing me perfectly. "Come on, buddy," I muttered, glancing nervously between my mirrors and the empty road ahead. "Either pass or back off." The truck did neither. For miles it stayed right there, matching my speed down to the mile per hour. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. That's when things got weird. I blinked and suddenly the Peterbilt was gone, vanished into thin air. I let out a shaky laugh, convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. Sleep deprivation was a hell of a drug after all. But then, impossibly, headlights appeared in front of me. The same cherry-red Peterbilt materialized out of the darkness, now a quarter-mile ahead. I slammed on the brakes, the sudden deceleration throwing me against my seatbelt. This couldn't be happening. There was no way that truck could have gotten in front of me. Heart pounding, I watched as the Peterbilt's taillights grew smaller and smaller until they winked out of existence altogether. I pulled over at the next rest stop, hands shaking as I cut the engine. I splashed water on my face in the grimy bathroom, staring at my haggard reflection in the mirror. "Get it together," I told myself. "You're overtired imagining things." When I got back on the road, the night was quiet. No sign of any ghostly big rigs. By the time I rolled into the truck stop outside Cheyenne, I'd almost convinced myself it had all been a bad dream. Almost. 2 nights later, I was eastbound on I-70, cutting through the heart of Kansas. The endless sea of wheat fields glowed silver under a fat harvest moon. It was peaceful until I spotted a familiar shape in my mirrors. The Peterbilt was back. This time, I was ready. I grabbed my phone off the dashboard, fumbling to open the camera app. Whatever this thing was, I was going to get proof. But every time I tried to snap a picture, the camera would freeze. The screen went black, then rebooted over and over. By the time I got it working again, the truck was gone. Not for long, though. Seconds later, it reappeared, now pacing me in the left lane, close enough to touch if our windows had been open. That's when I saw the driver, or rather the absence of one. The cab was empty, the steering wheel turning on its own as the truck matched my every move. I'm not ashamed to admit I panicked. I stomped on the gas, pushing my rig to speeds it was never meant to go. The engine roared in protest as the needle climbed past 90, 100, 110. The Peterbilt kept pace easily, that empty cab mocking me. Ahead, I saw the glowing signs of a small town. Salvation. I took the exit ramp at speeds that nearly sent me rolling, fishtailing onto the main street of whatever one-horse town I'd stumbled into. I screeched to a halt in front of the only open business, a 24-hour diner straight out of the 1950s, and bolted inside. The handful of patrons, mostly other long-haul drivers catching a late dinner, stared as I burst through the door. "Did you see it?" I demanded, wild-eyed. "The red truck? Tell me you saw it." The waitress, a grandmotherly type with a name tag reading Dottie, gently sat me down in a booth. "Honey, there's no red truck out there, just yours." I whipped my head around to look out the plate glass windows. She was right. The street was empty save for my own blue Freightliner. Dottie set a steaming cup of coffee in front of me. "Why don't you tell me what's got you so spooked?" So I did. I told her everything. The first encounter in Nebraska, the impossible physics of a truck that could vanish and reappear at will, the empty cab. As I spoke, I could see the other drivers in the diner leaning in, listening intently. When I finished, the diner was silent. Then one of the older truckers cleared his throat. "I've seen it too," he said quietly. "About 10 years back on a stretch of US 50 in Nevada. Thought I was losing my mind." Another driver chimed in. "I had a run-in with something similar in the Smoky Mountains. Damn thing chased me for 50 miles before it disappeared." One by one, other drivers shared their stories. It wasn't always a Peterbilt. Sometimes it was a Kenworth or a Mack, or makes that hadn't been on the road in decades. But the pattern was the same. An impossibly pristine truck that appeared out of nowhere, paced the victim for miles, then vanished into thin air. "They call it the Phantom 18-wheeler, Dottie said, topping off my coffee. "Been hearing stories about it for as long as I've worked here. Some say it's the ghost of a trucker who died on the job, doomed to haunt the highways forever. Others think it's something else, something not of this world, just wearing the shape of a truck." I shuddered. "But why? Why is it out there?" An old-timer at the counter turned to face me, his eyes grave. "It's a warning," he said, "or a test, for drivers who are pushing themselves too hard, driving when they should be resting. The Phantom appears when you're at your most vulnerable, your most tired. If you're lucky, the scare puts you off the road for the night. If you're not..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. We'd all heard the stories of inexplicable single-vehicle accidents, of trucks found wrapped around trees with no sign of what caused the driver to lose control. I stayed at that diner until dawn, swapping stories with the other drivers, all of us finding comfort in the knowledge that we weren't alone in our experiences. When the sun finally peeked over the horizon, I felt steady enough to get back on the road. But things were different after that night. I became religious about my sleep schedule, never pushing past the point of exhaustion. I learned to recognize the signs of fatigue and pull over before they got the better of me. And on those long, dark nights when the road seemed to go on forever, I keep one eye on my mirrors, always watching for a glimpse of cherry red paint gleaming in the moonlight. Because out there on America's highways, in the spaces between cities where the real world feels far away, the Phantom 18-wheeler is still rolling, waiting for tired eyes and heavy eyelids, waiting to remind us that sometimes the real danger isn't what's on the road. They say truckers are the lifeblood of America, but Maggie, she was its beating heart and its all-seeing eye. I just didn't know how literal that was until it was too late. It was just another run-of-the-mill Tuesday when I first laid eyes on Maggie's truck stop diner. You know the type. A weathered building squatting on the edge of nowhere, neon sign flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. I'd been on the road for 14 hours straight, my eyes gritty from staring at endless miles of asphalt, and my stomach growling loud enough to drown out the rumble of my rig. The gravel lot was half full, a mix of big rigs and the occasional car with out-of-state plates. As I killed the engine, the sudden silence was almost deafening. I sat there for a moment, letting the tension slowly leak out of my shoulders. Home might be 800 miles away, but for tonight, this was close enough. The bell above the door jangled as I stepped inside, and I was hit with the comforting smell of coffee and grease. A handful of drivers hunched over the counter while a couple of families occupied booths along the windows. But it was the waitress behind the counter who caught my eye. She couldn't have been a day under 65, with steel gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and laugh lines etched deep around her eyes. Her name tag read Maggie in faded letters. "Well, hello there, sugar," she called out, her voice warm and raspy from years of cigarettes. "Plant yourself wherever you like. Coffee?" I nodded gratefully, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "Black as midnight, please." Maggie set a steaming mug in front of me, then leaned in conspiratorially. "You look like you could use something stronger than coffee. Rough day on the road?" I blinked, surprised. "How'd you know?" She tapped the side of her nose with a wink. "Honey, I've been slinging hash in this joint for 30 years. I can read a trucker like a book. Now what'll it be? My money's on the meatloaf." And damn if she wasn't right. I hadn't even glanced at the menu, but suddenly meatloaf sounded like heaven on a plate. As I dug into my food, which was, true to Maggie's word, the best meatloaf this side of my grandmother's kitchen, I couldn't help but notice how she worked the room. She had a word for everyone, delivered with a smile and often a touch on the arm or shoulder. But it was more than that. She seemed to know exactly what each person needed before they asked. A refill for the guy 3 stools down, right as his cup hit empty. The extra side of gravy for the family in the corner booth seconds before the husband could open his mouth to request it. A fresh napkin for the rookie driver who was about to knock over his water glass. It was uncanny. As the night wore on and the diner emptied out, I found myself lingering over cup after cup of coffee. Maggie kept up a steady stream of chatter, and I soon realized she knew everyone's story. Not just the regulars, but the one-time passers-through as well. "See that fella over there?" she said, nodding towards a burly driver hunched over a slice of pie. "That's Big Mike. He's hauling a load of electronics to Reno. Got 3 kids at home and a wife working 2 jobs to make ends meet. And the couple by the window? Newlyweds, eloping to Vegas. Her folks don't approve, but they'll come around eventually." I raised an eyebrow. "Maggie, how could you possibly know all that?" She just laughed, a sound like gravel under tires. "Oh, honey, when you've been here as long as I have, you pick things up. People talk, you know, and I listen." But as the weeks went by and I found myself stopping at Maggie's more and more often, I started to realize it went deeper than that. She didn't just know about the drivers who came through regularly. She knew about everyone. Every single person who walked through that door. She had their number in seconds, and it wasn't just surface stuff either. She knew things she had no way of knowing. Like the night she stopped a driver from getting back on the road, insisting he stay at the motel next door. "Trust me, sugar," she'd said, her eyes suddenly serious. "You don't want to be on I-80 tonight, not with that ice storm rolling in." The thing was, the weather report had called for clear skies, but sure enough, 3 hours later, the highway was shut down due to a massive pileup caused by black ice. Or the time she talked a young couple out of taking a shortcut through the mountains. "That road's not as safe as it used to be," she warned. "Stick to the main highway." We found out later there had been a massive landslide on that very route. It was like she had some kind of sixth sense, some deep connection to the ebb and flow of the roads and the lives that traveled them. And the weird thing was, nobody seemed to question it. They just accepted Maggie's omniscience as part of the package, like the mediocre coffee and the world-class pie. But I couldn't let it go. The more I saw, the more convinced I became that there was something not quite right about Maggie. Something more than human. It all came to a head on a stormy night in late October. I'd been fighting a nasty head cold for days and probably shouldn't have been behind the wheel at all. But deadlines were deadlines, and I had a load that needed to be in Chicago by morning. I stumbled into the diner, head pounding and chills racking my body. Maggie took one look at me and her eyes narrowed. "Oh no, sweetheart," she said, her voice brooking no argument. "You're not going anywhere tonight." I tried to protest, but she was already steering me towards a booth in the back. "But my deadline—" "We'll still be there in the morning," she finished firmly. "Now sit. I'm making you my special chicken soup. It'll fix you right up." As I sank into the cracked vinyl seat, I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. The diner seemed to shimmer and warp around the edges like a mirage on a hot highway. And for just a moment, I swore I saw something else layered over Maggie's grandmotherly form. Something vast and ancient, with eyes that seemed to see everything all at once. I blinked and it was gone. Just Maggie stirring a pot on the stove. But I knew what I'd seen, and suddenly all the pieces fell into place. "What are you?" I whispered when she brought me the soup. Maggie's smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes changed, became deeper, older. "Now, sugar," she said softly, "I think you already know the answer to that." "But why?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why here? Why us?" She sighed, settling into the booth across from me. "Because you need me," she said simply. "All of you. Out there on those long, lonely roads. Someone has to watch over you, keep you safe and well-fed," she added with a wink. I stared at her, this impossible being wearing the shape of a truck stop waitress. Are you some kind of god?" Maggie threw back her head and laughed, the sound filling the empty diner. "Oh, honey, nothing so grand as all that. Let's just say I'm a guardian. a protector of travelers and tellers of tales. I've had many names over the centuries, but Maggie suits me just fine for now. She reached across the table and patted my hand. Her touch was warm, comforting, and I felt the fog of my cold lifting almost immediately. Now eat your soup, dear. You've got a long road ahead of you, and I aim to see you travel it safely. As I spooned the miraculously healing soup into my mouth, I realized that the world was a lot stranger and more wonderful than I'd ever imagined, and that sometimes salvation comes in the form of a never-empty coffee cup and a slice of homemade pie. These days, I still stop at Maggie's whenever I'm passing through. The coffee's still mediocre, the pie's still heavenly, and Maggie's still Maggie. All-knowing, all-seeing, and always ready with exactly what you need, whether you know you need it or not. And on those long, dark nights when the road seems endless and the loneliness threatens to swallow you whole, it helps to know that somewhere out there, in a little diner on the edge of nowhere, there's a light always on and a guardian angel disguised as a waitress watching over all of us wayward travelers. Just don't ask her about the special. Some mysteries are best left unsolved. The first time I saw the black SUV, I thought nothing of it. By the fifth time, I was convinced it was either a government conspiracy or I was losing my mind. Turns out the truth was far stranger than either. It started on a Tuesday. Tuesdays are always rough in this business. Far enough from the weekend to feel the grind, but not close enough to Friday to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I was hauling a load of auto parts from Detroit to Phoenix, cutting through the heartland on I-70. The morning sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, painting the Kansas wheat fields gold when I first spotted it in my rear view. A sleek black SUV, windows tinted so dark they looked like pools of ink. Nothing unusual about that, probably some exec running late for a meeting in Kansas City. But then it passed me, and I swear, just for a second, I locked eyes with the driver. He was pale, almost unnaturally so, with close-cropped white hair and sunglasses that reflected my own startled expression back at me. A chill ran down my spine, though I couldn't have said why. I shook it off. Long hours on the road can play tricks on your mind, make you see things that aren't there. I cranked up the radio and focused on the miles ahead. By the time I hit Colorado, I'd forgotten all about the SUV. The Rockies loomed ahead, a welcome change from the monotony of the plains. I was looking forward to the challenge of navigating the mountain passes, my rig growling as we climbed higher and higher. That's when I saw it again. Same black SUV, same tinted windows. It flew past me on a stretch of straight road, then disappeared around a bend. My hands tightened on the wheel. Once is coincidence, twice is... Well, I didn't know what it was, but I didn't like it. I pulled into a rest stop just outside Denver, my nerves jangling. As I walked back from the bathroom, I froze. There, parked 2 spots down from my rig, was the SUV. No sign of the driver, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from behind those tinted windows. I practically ran back to my truck, peeling out of that rest stop like the devil himself was on my tail. For the next 100 miles, I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see that damn SUV materialize out of thin air. But there was nothing. Just the usual mix of cars and trucks, everyone minding their own business. By the time I crossed into Utah, I'd convinced myself it was all in my head. Lack of sleep, too much caffeine, an overactive imagination. I resolved to get a good night's rest at the next truck stop. That resolution lasted about 3 hours. I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Utah. Nothing but red rocks and scrub brush as far as the eye could see. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of fire when my CB crackled to life. Breaker, breaker, this is Knight Rider. Got a smoky report for any westbound drivers, over. I keyed the mic. This is Big Blue, westbound on I-70. What's the word, Knight Rider? There was a burst of static, then. Got a black SUV playing tag with truckers, comes out of nowhere, rides your bumper for a few miles, then disappears. Keep your eyes peeled, driver. My blood ran cold. Roger that, Knight Rider. You wouldn't happen to have seen the driver, would you? White hair, sunglasses? Another burst of static. When Knight Rider's voice came back, it was hesitant. Now, how in the hell did you know that, Big Blue? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because at that moment, I spotted a familiar shape in my side mirror. The SUV was back, and it was gaining on me fast. My palms were slick with sweat as I gripped the wheel. The rational part of my brain said to just keep driving, to ignore it. But another part, a more primal part, was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that SUV as possible. It pulled alongside me, keeping perfect pace. The passenger window rolled down, revealing the white-haired driver. He turned to look at me and slowly removed his sunglasses. I'll never forget those eyes. They were old, impossibly old, filled with a wisdom and sadness that no human could possess. And they were looking right at me. The driver nodded once, then accelerated, the SUV quickly disappearing into the gathering darkness. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, those ancient eyes. By the time I rolled into Phoenix, I was running on nothing but adrenaline and truck stop coffee. I dropped off my load and booked a room at the first motel I saw. I needed real sleep, needed to try and make sense of what was happening to me. As I fumbled with the key card, a voice behind me made me jump. "Rough trip?" I spun around, and there he was. The driver, leaning against that black SUV, looking for all the world like he'd been waiting for me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Why are you following me?" He smiled, but it didn't reach those old eyes. "Walk with me," he said, gesturing towards a small park across the street. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to lock myself in that motel room and not come out until he was gone. But my feet were moving before I could stop them. We walked in silence for a while, the desert night cool around us. Finally, he spoke. "I'm not what you think I am," he said quietly. "I'm not government. I'm not some stalker. I'm a guardian of sorts," I snorted. "A guardian of what?" "Of the roads, of the travelers who use them." He paused, looking up at the star-filled sky. "Of the balance between this world and the next." I waited for the punchline, for him to laugh and tell me this was all some elaborate prank, but he just stood there, utterly serious. "You're insane," I said flatly. He chuckled. "Maybe, but I think you know that's not true. You've felt it, haven't you? The strangeness out there on the long hauls, the things that don't quite add up, the stories that truckers tell each other in the dead of night, too afraid to believe but too shaken to entirely disbelieve." I thought about the phantom hitchhikers I'd heard about, the stretches of road where time seemed to bend, the unexplained lights in the sky over the desert. What are you?" I whispered. "I've had many names over the centuries," he said. "But you can call me the Watcher. I keep an eye on things, make sure the barriers between worlds don't wear too thin. And sometimes when I see someone who might be in danger of crossing over before their time, I intervene." "Is that what this was?" I asked. "An intervention?" He nodded. "You were pushing yourself too hard, taking too many risks. Another day or two and you might have fallen asleep at the wheel, ended up on my side of things before you were meant to. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. So all those times I saw you. Warnings," he said simply. "Reminders to be careful, to respect the road and your own limits." We stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. "Why me?" I finally asked. "Why show yourself to me?" The Watcher smiled, and for a moment he looked almost human. "Because you saw me. Really saw me. Most people, their minds skate right over the things that don't fit into their view of the world. But you noticed, you questioned. And sometimes that's all it takes to open a door to a bigger universe." He turned to go, then paused. "Be careful out there," he said. "The roads are long and the night is dark. But remember, you're not alone. None of you are." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the park with a head full of questions and a heart racing with possibilities I'd never considered before. I'm still driving, still crisscrossing the country, hauling everything from produce to machinery. But things are different now. I'm more careful, more aware. I take my breaks, get my sleep. And sometimes on those long, lonely stretches of midnight highway, I'll catch a glimpse of a black SUV in my mirrors. It's not fear I feel anymore when I see it. It's reassurance, a reminder that there's more to this world than what we see on the surface, that even in the darkest night, on the loneliest road, someone is watching over us. So the next time you're out on the highway and you see a black SUV with tinted windows, give a little wave. You never know. The Watcher might just wave back.